Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Aisha Nazir. Our today's topic is constructor and its properties. What is constructor? Why we need constructors in our program, in our class? What type of role it plays in the life of a class? So let's see. So constructor, as the name specify, constructor means construct something. So basically in C++ programming and in a program, constructor constructs the object. That's reason we give it the name of constructor. When we create an object, it automatically calls the constructor, that is a method, a function in C++ language, and it basically constructs that object for that specific class. Fine. So let's see what are the constructor in detail. So types of constructors in C++. There are many types. The first is the default constructor. The second one is the parameterized constructor. The third one is the copy constructor. And then constructors with default arguments and overloaded constructors. In today's lecture, we will see what are the default constructor, how we create them and how we call them, what is the functionality of the constructor, why we need constructor in our class, what functions it performs, and then after that we will see the parameterized constructors. Why we need parameterized constructors, which is the best techniques, default constructors or the parameterized constructors. Let's see in detail. So a constructor in C++ is a special method that is automatically called when an object of a class is created. So noted the first point, that constructor is a method. Second thing, it is automatically called. When it is called? When we create an object of a class. Clear? So a constructor is a special type of method function, member function, that initializes an object automatically when it is created. The other main point is that constructors are basically used to initialize the object. To create a constructor, use the same name as the class followed by parentheses. So how we will differentiate the constructor from the other member functions? The key is that the constructor would be the same as the class because it's creating the object of that specific class. So the constructor name must be the same as the class, followed by the parenthesis, as we always used with all the member functions when we declare the function. We got the four main points. Number one, the constructor is a C++ special method. Number two, it is automatically called when an object of a class is created. Number three, it initializes objects values automatically. Number four, it has the same name as the class. So how the compiler knows it's a constructor? Because there are multiple functions in a class. So what thing make the constructor unique and make it special so that the compiler got to know that it's a constructor? Compiler identifies a given member function is a constructor by its name and the return type. Means the name, the constructor must have a special name, and from the return type, the compiler we got to know that it's a constructor by the two things. One is the name and the other is the return type. So is it a special type of name or its return type must be special? Let's see. Constructor has the same name as that of the class, and it doesn't have any return type, right? Means we define different member functions in our class, and we give them unique names, and we give them names as their functionality. But the constructor has edge upon the other member functions is that it has the same name as the class name. So whenever you see any function in the class definition with the same name as the class, it means that it's a constructor. The second main point is that constructor doesn't have any return type. There is no any return type of constructor. Why? Because it never returns any value. It is used to build the object. It is used to construct the object. Hopefully you got the point. Also, the constructor is always public. Keep in mind, we define multiple functions as private, as public, as protected. But there is a restriction with the constructor, is that it must be always public. So, in this slide, we see three main points. Number one, the compiler has the same name as the class name. Number two, it doesn't have any return type. Number three, it must be public. So, why we use constructor in C++? There are multiple scenarios in which we need constructors. For example, suppose you are working on hundreds of person object and the default value of data member age is 0. Initializing all objects manually will be a very tedious task. We have to initialize first value, then the second person, then the third person, then the fourth person, and then onward the 100% with the value 0. It will be very hectic task. So to get rid of this hectic task, we use constructor. Instead, we define a constructor that initializes age to 0. Then all you have to do is create a person object, and the constructor will automatically initialize the age. So whenever we create a new object, the constructor will automatically called, and it initializes the person's age as 0 by default. So now there is no restrictions of members, no restrictions of persons, as much as object you can add in your program, as much as data you can put in your program. So there is no any restriction. So this is the main advantage of constructor. These situations basically arise frequently while handling arrays of objects. When we have a large arrays of objects and we have vectors. And so in these scenarios, constructor works very well. Also, if you want to execute some code immediately after an object is created. For example, if we wish that when we created an object, a file is automatically opened. When we create an object, a form is displayed on the screen. When we create an object, it will ask the user and a prompt will display on your screen and it will ask the user the value. So if we want that when an object is created, some default settings established and shown on the screen, then we use the constructor. And what the constructor is do, what the default settings will do, we have to perform and specify all these settings inside the body of the constructors. Whatever we want that a constructor will do for us, we have to specify that functionality, we have to mention that functionality in the body of the constructor. So here is a simple example of constructor. Let's code it into the code block editor so that you better got to know how the constructor works. So here we are in code block editor of C++. So let's start our example of the constructor. So first of all, we have to define the class. So first we declare the class, and then we define the definition of the class. So first of all, class. We use the keyword class with name of the class, my class, and the curly brackets. And this is the class declaration. So when we define the body, then it will become the class definition. Okay. First of all, we will define the access specifier. That would be public. So after that, first we will define the constructor. How we will define the constructor? My class. This is the same as the class. So why I am defining the class here again? Don't be confused. This is not the class. This is basically the constructor. As I have told you earlier, that the constructor has the same name as your class, followed by the parenthesis. So this is the declaration of your constructor. So let's write it as constructor. This is your constructor. And now let's define the body of the constructor. For example, I created a system, and I want that whenever a customer opens my system, a message is shown that welcome customer. So we want just to print out some value on the screen as the system gets started. So first of all, we will write cout for the print statement, cout, and then inverted commas, that whatever we want to print on the screen, welcome to my C++ Learning Institute. So I want that whenever a student opens my system, a method by default shows on the screen as welcome to my C++ Learning Institute. Right? So we will just give the break statement. So this is our constructor in which we define the first value. Okay, one thing, we haven't defined the return type. Keep in mind that constructor never returns any value. So we haven't defined any return type over here. We just want to print. We just want to define some default values. We just want to define and establish some default settings. So that's the reason we use the constructors. So when this constructor will call, obviously when we create the object. For example, if we create the object as my class, because we are going to create the object of my class, and the object name is my obj. So as the object is created, it immediately calls the constructor, and it will print welcome to my learning institute on the console. So let's compile it. So constructors in C++, there are three types of constructors in C++. Number one is default constructor. Number two is parameterized constructor. Number three is copy constructor. Let's see each of them one by one in detail. So there are basically two main types of constructors in C++. Default constructors, parameterized constructors. Default constructors. Our default constructor doesn't have any argument or parameters. As we have seen in the previous example that we haven't defined any parameter, any arguments in the constructor. So that was an example of default constructor. Let's understand the default constructor with another example of websites. So let's move towards the code block editor. So here we are in the code block editor. So let's zoom in so that it's easier to read or understand for you. So first of all, we will define the class as class website. So this is the class, and then we define the public access specifier, and under the public section we define the constructor, which would be the same as the class name. So website followed by parenthesis, and now we define the body. Oops, I haven't seen that what I have written. It's website. Okay. So what we want that whenever any student open the system, then a welcome message will shown for him. So we will simply print a statement and like cout welcome student. So after the end statement, as you can see that in this constructor we haven't defined any arguments, any parameter in these parentheses. As you all know that we always define the parameters in the parentheses. That makes the constructor a parameterized constructor, but we haven't defined any values, any parameters and arguments over here. So this is the default constructor. What it means that whenever I created an object, this default value will be shown on the screen. So let's create the object. So let's create the object. So the class name website and obj1. So when this statement, when the object is created, so by default this value will be executed, this statement will be executed, and this message will be shown on the screen. But what if we create multiple objects? For example, if I create another object, website object 2, or I create website object 3, now what will happen? Is it this statement prints only once? This constructor will show this statement only once? No, it will show this statement 3 times because we created 3 different objects of a class website. So let's compile it and run it. So here is the result. As you can see it prints the same welcome student 3 times because we created 3 different objects. So this is an example of default constructor in which we haven't passed any argument, any parameters. So here is the output, as you can see that welcome students displays 3 times. When you don't specify any constructor in the class, a default constructor with no code, with empty body would be inserted into your code by compiler. Parameterized constructor. Constructor with parameterized are known as parameterized constructors. These types of constructors allow us to pass arguments while object creation. Means when we define the object, when we create the object, then we can pass the arguments that the constructor will receive as a parameter. So let's see. let's say class name is XYZ. So what will be the syntax of the default constructor? Here we define the default constructor XYZ, and this is the creation of object of the XYZ class. While on the other hand, in the parameterized constructor, here we created the constructor XYZ with the parameters int A, int B. It means it receives two parameters, two arguments. While in the main method, when we create the XYZ object, remember XYZ is the class name. So when we create the object of XYZ class, so here we pass the values, arguments that the constructor will receive as parameter. So 10 and 20 will pass to the constructor. 10 will be assigned to A, while 20 will be assigned to B. Let's understand it with another example. Let's move towards the code block. Here we are in the code block. So first we will define a class, and we are going to make a simple example with parameterized constructor of adding two members, addition. So first of all we zoom it so that you understand it. Okay, so first we are going to define class. The class name is add. After that, we are going to define the public access specifier, and in the public section, first we will define the parameterized constructor. So we will write here as parameterized constructor. Okay. So we will define the constructor. As you know that first of all, we define the constructor name, that would be the add, same as the class name, and then we pass the parameters. So we will take two parameters of integer type, int num1 and int num2. So we created a parameterized constructor with two parameters. Okay, after that we define the body of the constructor. So in the body we will define the calculations, the function that we want to perform. So first of all we want to define the calculation. Here is like num1 plus num2. We want this functionality. So why not that we print it on the screen directly? So we write cout and then insertion operator, and then we pass parenthesis to define that this is an expression, and then we will define handle. Okay, so this is our class add, in which we define public access specifier, and we define a constructor with the name of add, and here in the body we define that print out whatever the value we pass in num1 and num2, add them and print the results on the screen. So now let's come towards the main section. Okay, so first we will create the object of add obj1, and here we will pass the argument. For example, we give the 10 and second value would be 20. Okay, we can, which is built in, and then run it. Okay, so here is the output. As you can see, this is the output, which is 30. Another interesting thing which we need to understand is this is the one way of creating the object. There is another way. The another way of creating object is known as explicit calling the constructor. This is the way where the constructor call automatically by itself when we create the object. But if we want to call explicitly the constructor, so what we will do, we will define class name, add, then object name, object2, and then assignment operator, and then we call the constructor explicitly by defining the name, and here we will pass the values, for example 30 and 40. The implicit call to the constructor. So let's write here as this is the implicit call to constructor, while this is the explicit call to the constructor. So mention here as this is the explicit call to the constructor. Hopefully you understand the both ways of constructor calling. The first one is the implicit and the other one is the explicit calling of the constructor. Let's run it. We build it. Here is no any error. So okay, so here is the output. As you can see that 30 and 70. This is the output. This is the result of implicit constructor and this is the result of explicit constructor. So up till now we see the constructor and the two types of constructor, default constructor and parameterized constructor. So what is the difference between the constructor and member function? Let's see how a constructor is different from member functions of the class. Constructor doesn't have a return type, while the member function has a return type. As we have earlier discussed that constructor doesn't have return type, we never define the return type. While in the member function, we have to define the return type to perform some calculations, to perform some functionality. Number 2, constructor is automatically called when we create the object of the class. Member functions need to be called explicitly using the object of a class. Means when we create the object, constructor will automatically called. We never need to call it. While on the other hand, in the member functions, when we create the object, we are unable to call the member functions, but we have explicitly defined the object and then by using the dot operator we will call the member function. So this is the second difference between the constructor and member functions. Number 3, when we do not create any constructor in our class, then the C++ compiler generates a default constructor and insert it in our code by default. Even the user didn't know about it. The same doesn't apply to the member functions. The compiler doesn't create any member function by default, while on the other hand, compiler only creates the constructor by default for the user if the user never defines the constructor in the class. So let's sum up constructor. A constructor is a special kind of class member function that is automatically called when an object of that class is instantiated, means when we create the object of that class. Constructors are typically used to initialize member variables of the class, to appropriate default or user provided values, or to do any setup steps necessary for the class to be used. For example, open a file or database. Unlike normal member functions, constructors have special rules for how they must be named. Constructor must have the same name as the class with the same capitalization. Constructors have no return type not even void. So 3 main points that we need to remember about the constructor is that number 1, constructor has the same name as the class. Number 2, it is always public. Number 3, it doesn't have any return type. So this was all about today's lecture. Hopefully you grasped the concept easily, and thank you very much.